The air inside Buckingham Palace was thick with tension. Two powerful figures stood face to face, their voices rising with each passing second. Then, without warning, a royal guard did something that shocked everyone in the room. He stepped directly between them, breaking centuries of protocol in a split-second decision that would change everything. What happened in those next few moments would be talked about in palace corridors for years to come. This isn't just another royal disagreement. This is the story of when duty collided with loyalty, when protocol shattered, and when one man's decision in the heat of the moment revealed secrets the palace never wanted exposed. Stay with us. The morning of June 12th began like most days at Buckingham Palace. Staff members moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, preparing for the day's schedule of meetings and official duties. The summer sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. In the kitchen, chefs were already preparing lunch for the royal household. In the staterooms, housekeepers were arranging fresh flowers in crystal vases. Everything appeared normal, orderly, perfectly controlled as it always did within these historic walls. But beneath this calm surface, tension had been building for weeks. King Charles and Prince William had been at odds over a decision that would affect the future direction of the monarchy. The disagreement centered on how to handle a sensitive family matter that had the potential to damage the royal family's public image. Charles wanted to take a traditional approach, keeping matters private and handling everything internally. William, however, believed that transparency and a more modern approach were necessary to maintain public trust in an era where secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. The argument had started in private meetings, with careful diplomatic language and measured tones, but as days turned into weeks without resolution, the conversations had become more heated. Other family members had been pulled into the debate, each taking sides based on their own views of what the monarchy should represent in the 21st century. Palace staff had noticed the change in atmosphere. Meetings ran longer than scheduled. Doors that were usually left open were now firmly closed. The usual pleasant exchanges between father and son had become formal and strained. Captain James Morrison had served as a royal protection officer for 12 years. At 42 years old, he was one of the most experienced guards in the detail assigned to protect senior members of the royal family. He had served in the British Army for 8 years before joining the Royal Protection Unit, including 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he had earned commendations for his calm judgment under pressure. James was known among his colleagues for his professionalism, his discretion, and his ability to remain neutral in any situation. He understood that his job was to protect the royal family, not to involve himself in their personal affairs. On this particular morning, James was assigned a security detail for a private meeting scheduled between King Charles and Prince William in the king's private study. The meeting had been on the calendar for 3 days, listed simply as a father-son discussion, with no other attendees specified. James had positioned himself outside the study door as protocol required, along with another officer named David Chen, who stood at the far end of the corridor. Their job was to ensure privacy and security while remaining unobtrusive and professional at all times. The meeting began at 10 o'clock in the morning. James heard the door close and the sound of chairs moving inside the study. For the first 20 minutes, he could hear only the low murmur of conversation, nothing that suggested any particular tension or disagreement. He stood at attention, his mind focused on his surroundings, watching the corridor for any unusual activity or potential security concerns. This was routine work, kind of duty he had performed hundreds of times before without incident. Then the tone inside the study began to change. James could hear voices rising, though he couldn't make out specific words through the heavy oak door. This wasn't entirely unusual. He had been present during other family disagreements over the years. The royals were human beings with normal family dynamics, despite what the public might imagine. His training had taught him to remain professional and to give the family privacy during personal moments unless there was a clear security threat. But something about this particular argument felt different. The volume continued to increase. James heard furniture moving, as if someone had stood up abruptly. There was a sharp sound that might have been a hand slapping against a desk. The voices were now clearly audible, even through the door, though the words were still unclear. James exchanged a quick glance with David down the corridor. Both men remained at their posts, but their alertness had increased. They were now monitoring the situation more carefully, ready to respond if needed. Inside the study, the conversation had indeed escalated beyond anything either King Charles or Prince William had intended. What had started as an attempt at calm discussion had quickly devolved into a heated exchange of long-held frustrations. Charles felt that William was being disrespectful of traditions that had sustained the monarchy for generations. William felt that his father was refusing to acknowledge the changing world and the need for the royal family to adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. Both men loved each other deeply, but in this moment, that love was buried beneath layers of anger, disappointment, and fear about the future. The specific issue they were debating involved a family member whose behavior had become increasingly problematic. This person had made decisions that reflected poorly on the royal family, and their actions had been noticed by the press. So far, the media coverage had been minimal.
Ow!
But palace advisors warned that it was only a matter of time before the story exploded into a full scandal. Charles wanted to handle it quietly, perhaps arranging for the family member to step back from public duties temporarily while receiving private support. William argued that this approach was exactly what had failed the family in the past, that hiding problems only made them worse when they inevitably came to light. Charles stood from his chair, his voice rising with frustration. He reminded William that he was still the king, that certain decisions were his alone to make, and that William's role was to support those decisions even when he disagreed with them. William also stood, his own frustration boiling over. He countered that being king didn't mean being right about everything, that the monarchy's survival depended on learning from past mistakes, and that blindly following old patterns would lead to disaster. The argument touched on deeper issues between them. Charles felt that William sometimes showed a lack of respect for his experience and judgment. William felt that his father sometimes dismissed his concerns without truly listening. Years of small tensions, minor disagreements, and unspoken frustrations were suddenly pouring out in this private room. Both men said things they would later regret, their anger pushing them to speak more harshly than they normally would. Outside the door, James Morrison was now genuinely concerned. The volume inside the study had reached a level he had never heard before in all his years of service. He could clearly hear raised voices, though the thick door still muffled the exact words. He heard what sounded like papers being thrown or books being slammed. The sound suggested a confrontation that had gone far beyond a normal family disagreement. James faced a difficult decision. Protocol dictated that he should not interfere in private family matters, but his primary duty was to ensure the safety of the royal family members under his protection. James moved closer to the door, listening more carefully. He was trying to assess whether this was simply a heated argument, or whether it had crossed into territory where someone's safety might be at risk. He heard Charles's voice, loud and clear, demanding respect for his authority. He heard William's response, equally loud, challenging his father's judgment. Then he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A sharp crack that could have been many things, but in that moment, sounded like potential violence. Without another second of hesitation, James made a decision that would define his career and possibly alter his life forever. He opened the door to the king's private study without permission, without announcement, and without waiting to be invited. This action violated every protocol he had been taught. Royal guards did not interrupt private meetings. They did not enter rooms without permission. They maintained their posts and respected the privacy of the family they served. But James had heard something that triggered his protective instincts, and he chose duty over protocol in that split second. The scene that greeted him when he opened the door was both better and worse than he had imagined. King Charles and Prince William were not physically fighting, which was the fear that had driven James to act, but they were standing extremely close to each other. Both men's faces red with anger, their body language aggressive and confrontational. Charles had his finger pointed directly at William's chest, emphasizing some point with physical gesture. William had his arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched, his entire posture radiating defiance and anger. The crack James had heard was apparently a book that Charles had thrown onto the floor in frustration. its pages now scattered across the expensive carpet. Both men turned to look at James in complete shock. A royal protection officer had just burst into the king's private study during a confidential meeting. The breach of protocol was stunning, unprecedented, and in that moment seemed almost absurd. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Charles and William stared at James. James stared back at them, his hand still on the door handle, suddenly aware of the enormity of what he had just done. The anger that had filled the room a moment before was replaced by confusion and surprise. James Morrison stood in the doorway of the king's study, suddenly very aware that he had just committed what could be a career-ending mistake. His training told him to assess the situation quickly and act decisively. But his training had never covered a scenario quite like this. He had interrupted the king during a private meeting. He had entered without permission. He had violated protocol in the most fundamental way possible. Yet as he looked at the scene before him, seeing the intense anger and confrontation between father and son, he felt his decision had been justified even if the consequences would be severe. King Charles was the first to find his voice. His tone was cold, controlled, and carried the full weight of his authority. He asked James why he had entered the room without permission. There was no shouting, no overt anger in his voice, which somehow made the question more intimidating. The king's displeasure was evident in every syllable. In the way he stood rigidly upright, in the way his eyes fixed on James with an expression that demanded an explanation. Prince William had stepped back slightly, his own anger momentarily forgotten as he watched this unprecedented breach of royal protocol unfold before him. James chose his words carefully. He explained that he had heard sounds that caused him concern for the safety of those in the room. He stated that his primary duty was the protection of the royal family, and that he had acted on what he believed to be a potential security situation. He kept his voice steady and professional, even as his heart pounded in his chest. He did not apologize for entering, because doing so would suggest he believed his action was wrong, and in that moment, he still believed he had made the right choice, even if it cost him his position. Charles's expression remained stern. He informed James that there was no security threat, that this was a private family discussion, and that his interruption was both unwelcome and inappropriate. William, however, was watching the exchange with a different expression. Something about seeing this guard standing there, having broken every rule to ensure their safety, seemed to penetrate through his anger. He glanced at his father, then back at James. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than frustration and resentment toward the situation the family found itself in. The tension in the room shifted into something different. What had been a heated argument between father and son was now a strange triangle, involving a protection officer who had stepped far beyond his role. James remained standing in the doorway, waiting for instructions. Charles was clearly deciding how to handle this unprecedented situation. William was observing both men, his analytical mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. The anger that had filled the room minutes before had been replaced by a complicated mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and uncertainty. Then William did something unexpected. He spoke directly to his father, his voice much calmer than it had been during their argument. He pointed out that James had heard them shouting at each other loudly enough to be genuinely concerned. He suggested that perhaps this interruption was a sign that they had both let their emotions override their better judgment. He said that if their argument was loud enough and heated enough, that a trained protection officer felt compelled to break protocol. Then perhaps they needed to step back and reconsider how they were handling their disagreement. Charles looked at his son, then at James, then back at his son. The observation was fair and hit harder than any argument William had made during their debate. The king took a deep breath, some of the rigid anger leaving his posture. He told James that he appreciated his dedication to duty, even if his methods were questionable. He instructed James to return to his post and to forget everything he had heard during the argument. It was a dismissal, but it was also an implicit acknowledgement that James's intentions had been good, even if his actions violated protocol. James nodded, relieved that he was being allowed to leave rather than being immediately dismissed from service. He stepped back into the corridor and closed the door behind him. his hands slightly shaking now that the immediate confrontation was over. David Chen, the other officer at the end of the corridor, was staring at him with wide eyes, clearly having heard some of what had transpired. James resumed his position outside the door, his mind racing through what had just happened and what the consequences might be. He had gambled his career on a judgment call, and while he hadn't been fired on the spot, he knew this incident would not simply be forgotten. Inside the study, Charles and William stood in silence for several moments. The interruption had broken the momentum of their argument, giving both men a chance to catch their breath and recognize how far they had let things escalate. Charles moved to pick up the book he had thrown, gathering its scattered pages with careful deliberation. William watched his father, seeing in that moment not the king, but a man who was struggling with impossible decisions and the weight of tremendous responsibility. The anger between them hadn't disappeared, but it had been dampened by the shock of having an outsider witness their private conflict. William was the first to speak, his voice quiet. He apologized for raising his voice and for some of the things he had said in anger. He emphasized that he still disagreed with his father's approach to their family problem, but he acknowledged that his manner of expressing that disagreement had been disrespectful. Charles accepted the apology with a slight nod, though his expression remained guarded. He admitted that he, too, had said things better left unsaid, and that perhaps they both needed to find a better way to communicate when they had serious disagreements. The conversation that followed was markedly different from the one that had preceded James's interruption. Both men sat down again, deliberately keeping their voices at normal volumes. They still disagreed about the fundamental issue at hand, but they began to discuss it more rationally. Charles explained his fears that too much transparency would invite a circus and make the situation worse for everyone involved. William countered with examples from recent royal history where secrecy had backfired spectacularly, damaging public trust in the institution they both wanted to protect. Meanwhile, news of the incident was already spreading through the palace's internal security network. David Chen had discreetly reported to the security coordinator that James had entered the king's study during a meeting without authorization. This report triggered a chain of communications that quickly reached the head of royal protection, a seasoned security professional named Sir Anthony Barrett, who had overseen royal security for 15 years. Sir Anthony immediately requested a full report on the incident and scheduled an emergency meeting with James IV. That afternoon, the palace staff had also become aware that something unusual had occurred. Housekeepers working in nearby corridors had heard the raised voices. The king's private secretary had been informed that a scheduled meeting was running much longer than anticipated. Personal assistants were quietly rearranging afternoon schedules to accommodate the extended discussion between Charles and William. In the peculiar ecosystem of palace life, information traveled quickly through unofficial channels, even when official channels remained silent. James stood at his post for another 90 minutes, during which the conversation inside the study continued at a normal volume. He could no longer hear what was being discussed, which was how it should have been from the beginning. He thought about his career, his family who depended on his income, and the decision he had made to open that door. He still believed he had done the right thing, but he also understood that good intentions didn't always protect people from consequences. Breaking protocol, no matter how justified the reason, was a serious matter in an institution built on centuries of tradition and rules. When the meeting finally ended, Prince William emerged first. He paused for just a moment when he saw James, their eyes meeting briefly. William gave a small nod, nothing more, but there was something in that gesture that suggested respect rather than anger. Then he continued down the corridor, his shoulders less tense than they had been when he arrived that morning. King Charles emerged a minute later, accompanied by his private secretary, who had been summoned to join them for the final portion of their discussion. Charles did not look at James as he passed, which in the complex language of royal behavior could mean many things. James was relieved from his post 30 minutes later and summoned to Sir Anthony Barrett's office in the security wing of the palace. The walk through the corridors felt longer than usual. He passed other protection officers who looked at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to sympathy. Everyone in the security detail had heard about the incident by now, and everyone was speculating about what would happen to the officer who had dared to interrupt the king Some thought he would be dismissed immediately. Others believed his actions might be quietly commended. Nobody knew for certain, which was typical of how the palace handled sensitive internal matters. Sir Anthony's office was a practical space with walls covered in security monitors and communication equipment. The head of royal protection was a man in his early 60s with gray hair and sharp blue eyes that had seen everything during his decades of service. He gestured for James to sit down, then spent several seconds reviewing documents on his desk before speaking. The silence was deliberate, a technique meant to increase pressure and encourage full honesty in what would follow. James sat quietly, his posture straight, his hands resting calmly in his lap despite the anxiety churning in his stomach. When Sir Anthony finally spoke, he got straight to the point. He asked James to explain his actions in detail, leaving nothing out. James provided a complete account of what he had heard, what he had thought was happening, and why he made the decision to enter the study without permission. He did not try to minimize his breach of protocol or make excuses. He simply laid out the facts as he had experienced them and explained his reasoning. Sir Anthony listened without interruption, his expression neutral, giving no indication of whether he agreed or disagreed with James's choices. After James finished his account, Sir Anthony sat back in his chair and studied him for a long moment. The head of royal protection had heard the initial reports, but hearing the story directly from James provided crucial context. He understood the impossible position James had been in, hearing what sounded like a potentially dangerous situation but unable to see what was actually happening. He also understood that protocol existed for important reasons, and that breaking those protocols, even with good intentions, could not simply be overlooked without consequences, sir? Anthony began by acknowledging that James had been in a difficult situation with no perfect options available. He noted that James had a distinguished service record with no previous incidents of inappropriate behavior or protocol violations. However, he also made clear that entering the king's private study without permission was an extremely serious matter that could not be dismissed lightly. The protection of the royal family included protecting their privacy and their dignity, not just their physical safety. James had violated that aspect of his duty, regardless of his motivations. The meeting lasted over an hour. Sir Anthony asked detailed questions about what James had heard, how he had interpreted those sounds, and what specific threat he believed existed. He examined whether there were alternative actions James could have taken, such as requesting permission to check on the situation or consulting with the senior officer on duty before making his decision. James answered each question honestly, acknowledging that in hindsight, there might have been other approaches, but maintaining that in the moment, with the information available to him, he had made what he believed was the necessary choice. As the conversation continued, Sir Anthony shared something that James had not known. King Charles himself had specifically requested that this matter be handled internally and that James not be subjected to formal disciplinary proceedings that would become part of his permanent record. The king had apparently told Sir Anthony that while the breach of protocol was unacceptable, he recognized that James had acted out of a genuine concern for safety rather than any malicious intent or desire to invade privacy. This information surprised James and gave him his first real hope that his career might survive this incident. However, there would still be consequences. Sir Anthony explained that James would be temporarily reassigned from close protection duties involving senior royals. For the next 3 months, he would work in other areas of palace security that were important but did not involve the same level of access to private family moments. This would serve as both a cooling-off period and a subtle form of discipline that sent a message to the entire protection team about the importance of respecting boundaries. After 3 months, his performance and judgment would be reevaluated, and decisions would be made about his future assignments. James accepted this outcome with relief. He had been prepared for much worse, including the possibility of dismissal from royal service entirely. A temporary reassignment was something he could work through, and the fact that King Charles had intervened on his behalf suggested that the situation might not permanently damage his career. Sir Anthony concluded the meeting by reminding James that discretion about what he had witnessed was absolutely essential. The argument between King Charles and Prince William was private family business, and any discussion of it outside proper channels would result in immediate termination. As James left Sir Anthony's office, he felt the weight of the day settling onto his shoulders. His decision to open that door had been the right one based on what he could hear and perceive from the corridor. But it had still caused complications that would affect him for months. He thought about his wife and 2 children at home and felt grateful that he still had a job to support them. He also thought about the brief nod Prince William had given him, and wondered what the future held for the royal family and the tensions that clearly existed beneath their public image of unity. The next few days at the palace were strange for everyone involved. King Charles and Prince William continued their scheduled duties, appearing at public events and conducting official business as if nothing had happened. To outside observers and the media, they seemed as cordial as ever, maintaining the professional relationship expected of them. But palace insiders could sense that something had shifted in their dynamic. They were more careful around each other, more formal in their interactions, as if the explosion of anger had made them both more aware of how much their disagreements could damage not just their personal relationship, but the institution they represented. James began his new assignment in the security control room, monitoring camera feeds and coordinating routine security checks throughout the palace complex. It was important work, but very different from the close protection duties he had performed for years. His colleagues in the control room treated him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Most of them had heard some version of what had happened, though the details remained unclear due to the blanket of discretion that covered all matters involving the royal family. Some saw him as someone who had made a courageous decision. Others viewed him as someone who had overstepped his authority and was lucky to still have a job. The incident between Charles and William, meanwhile, had forced both men to confront some uncomfortable truths about their relationship and their approach to leadership. Charles recognized that his traditional methods of handling problems weren't always effective in the modern world that his son understood better than he did. William acknowledged that his father's experience and caution came from decades of navigating complicated situations, and that dismissing those lessons entirely was both arrogant and potentially dangerous. Neither man would say they were grateful for James Morrison's interruption, but both privately admitted it had served as a necessary circuit breaker in a situation that was spiraling out of control. They eventually reached a compromise on the family matter they had been arguing about. It wasn't exactly what either of them wanted, but it incorporated elements of both approaches. The family member in question would step back from some public duties while receiving support. But there would also be a carefully managed statement to the press that acknowledged challenges without providing salacious details. It was a middle path that satisfied neither Charles's desire for complete privacy nor William's push for full transparency. But it was a solution they could both accept and present as a unified decision. Staff members who had heard the argument or knew about James's intervention gradually moved on to other concerns and responsibilities. Life in the palace continued with its usual rhythms of ceremony, tradition, and carefully managed public image. But those who had been close to the incident carried with them a deeper understanding of the human dynamics that existed behind the formal titles and the choreographed public appearances. The royal family, for all their privilege and position, dealt with the same family tensions and disagreements that affected people in every walk of life. James's wife, Sarah, had noticed something different about him in the days following the incident. He seemed more thoughtful, more quiet than usual. When she finally pressed him about what was bothering him, he could only tell her that something had happened at work that made him reassess his understanding of duty and protocol. He couldn't share specifics because of the confidentiality requirements of his job, but he talked in general terms about the difficulty of making split-second decisions when there were no clear right answers. Sarah listened and supported him, trusting that whatever had happened, her husband had acted with the integrity she had always known him to possess. 3 weeks after the incident, James received an unexpected message requesting his presence at a private meeting with Prince William. The meeting was to take place in one of the smaller palace offices rather than any formal stateroom, and it was scheduled for early evening when most of the day's official business had concluded. James felt nervous about this summons, uncertain what it might mean. He arrived at the specified office 15 minutes early, as his training dictated, and waited in the corridor until the exact appointed time before knocking on the door. Prince William opened the door himself, which was unusual. Normally, an assistant or secretary would handle such details. He invited James inside and gestured to a chair, taking a seat across from him rather than behind a desk. The informal arrangement was clearly intentional, designed to make the conversation feel less like an official meeting and more like a genuine discussion between two people. William began by thanking James for coming, then got directly to the point of why he had requested this meeting. He wanted James to know that he appreciated what James had done that day in his father's study. William acknowledged that it had been a breach of protocol and that there had to be consequences for that. But he also wanted James to understand that his action had served an important purpose, even if it wasn't the one James had intended. By interrupting the argument, James had forced both William and his father to step back from a confrontation that was becoming destructive. Sometimes, William explained, people needed an outside force to break them out of patterns that weren't serving them well. William went on to share something more personal. He talked about the pressures of royal life, the weight of knowing that every decision would be scrutinized and judged, the difficulty of balancing tradition with the need for change. He admitted that his relationship with his father was complicated. It's filled with love, but also with fundamental disagreements about how to lead the monarchy forward. He said that the argument James had witnessed was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of deeper tensions that they were both trying to navigate. By sharing these thoughts, William was treating James not as a servant or employee, but as someone worthy of trust and honest conversation. James listened carefully, honored by the prince's candor, but also aware of the delicate position he was in. He thanked William for the explanation and assured him that his discretion was absolute. He explained his own perspective on that day, how the sounds he heard had triggered his protective instincts, and how he had weighed the risk of overstepping against the risk of failing to act if there was genuine danger. William nodded. Understanding the impossible calculation James had been forced to make in those few seconds outside the study door, the conversation lasted about 30 minutes. When it concluded, William shook James's hand firmly and told him that he hoped James's temporary reassignment would end soon and that he would return to close protection duties. He said that the royal family needed people like James, people who took their responsibility seriously and who were willing to make difficult decisions when circumstances demanded it. James left the meeting feeling validated in a way he hadn't expected, understanding that sometimes breaking the rules was the right thing to do, even when it came with consequences. The months following the incident brought significant changes for everyone involved. Though most of these changes happened quietly behind palace walls where the public would never see them. King Charles and Prince William developed a new system for handling their disagreements, one that involved scheduled discussions with clear agendas and sometimes the presence of a neutral family member or trusted advisor who could help mediate when emotions ran high. They recognized that their spontaneous private meetings had a tendency to escalate because there was no structure to guide the conversation or cool things down when tensions rose. This new approach wasn't perfect, and they still had moments of frustration and disagreement. But the explosive confrontation that James had interrupted became a turning point that neither man wanted to repeat. Charles became more willing to listen to William's perspectives on modernizing certain aspects of royal protocol, even when those perspectives challenged his own beliefs. William, in turn, developed greater patience for his father's cautious approach to change, recognizing that protecting the monarchy's stability required careful consideration, rather than rapid transformation. The family matter they had been arguing about was eventually resolved, in a way that received minimal media attention. The approach they had agreed upon, combining elements of discretion with limited transparency, proved to be effective. The family member in question received the support they needed while gradually stepping back from public duties in a manner that appeared natural rather than forced. The press coverage, when it came, was brief and respectful, noting the situation without turning it into the scandal that both Charles and William had feared. This success reinforced their newfound ability to work together. Despite their different philosophies, James Morrison completed his 3-month reassignment period with exemplary performance. His supervisors in the security control room noted his professionalism, his attention to detail, and his ability to coordinate complex security operations from the monitoring station. He never complained about the temporary demotion, never sought sympathy from colleagues, and never discussed what had led to his reassignment. His discretion and dedication were observed and appreciated by those who knew the full story. And his reputation within the palace security team actually strengthened during this period. When the 3 months concluded, James was called to another meeting with Sir Anthony Barrett. This conversation was much shorter and more straightforward than their previous discussion. Sir Anthony informed James that he was being restored to close protection duties, though his specific assignment would be different from before. Rather than being assigned exclusively to King Charles or Prince William, he would be part of a rotating protection detail that served various senior members of the royal family depending on their schedules and security needs. This arrangement was presented as a normal career development rather than any kind of punishment, and James accepted it gratefully. The new assignment meant that James would sometimes be protecting the very people he had witnessed in their most vulnerable and unguarded moment. The first time he was assigned to Prince William's detail, after returning to close protection duties, there was a brief moment of recognition when they saw each other. William gave him the same small nod he had offered on the day of the incident, and James responded with a professional acknowledgement. No words were exchanged, but both men understood that they shared an experience that had changed their respective perspectives on duty, loyalty, and the complicated humanity of those who lived in palaces. Sarah Morrison noticed that her husband seemed more settled after returning to his regular duties. The thoughtfulness and quiet introspection that had marked the previous months gradually gave way to his usual confidence and engagement with his work. When she asked him if things were better at work, he simply smiled and said that he had learned some important lessons about judgment and that he felt good about where things stood. She didn't press for details, understanding that his work required confidentiality that he took seriously. But she was relieved to see him more at peace with whatever had been troubling him. The incident itself became one of those palace stories that lived on in whispered conversations among staff. Members who had been there at the time, new employees, would occasionally hear vague references to the day when a protection officer had walked in on an argument between the King and Prince of Wales. But the details were always sketchy and often embellished with speculation. James never contributed to these conversations, maintaining his silence about what had actually happened. The few people who knew the full truth respected that discretion and kept their own counsel about the matter. For King Charles, the incident served as a reminder that his role as king didn't exempt him from the need to manage his emotions and conduct himself with the dignity his position required. He had been raised to believe that the monarch should be above the petty conflicts and emotional displays that characterized normal human interaction. Yet he was also a father, a man with strong opinions and deep feelings about the future of his family and the institution he led. Finding the balance between these different aspects of his identity remained a constant challenge, one that the confrontation with William had highlighted in uncomfortable ways. He thought about James Morrison occasionally, about the expression on the guard's face when he had opened that door, and seen two men he was sworn to protect engaged in behavior that was anything but regal. Charles had been angry in the moment, but he later recognized that James's intervention had been based on legitimate concern and professional judgment. The fact that Charles had specifically requested lenient treatment for James reflected his understanding that good people sometimes had to break rules when circumstances demanded it. It was a lesson that applied to kings and protection officers alike. Prince William had his own reflections on what had happened. He thought about the pressure that had been building between him and his father, the way their different visions for the monarchy had created a tension that kept escalating until it exploded. He thought about how James Morrison's interruption had forced them to see themselves from an outside perspective, and how that perspective had been sobering and necessary. William began to understand that leadership wasn't just about having the right ideas or the correct vision for the future. It was also about managing relationships, controlling emotions, finding ways to work with people who saw the world differently. This understanding influenced how William approached other relationships within the family and the broader palace establishment. He became more patient in meetings with advisors who disagreed with his proposals. He learned to present his arguments more diplomatically, focusing on building consensus rather than forcing change through sheer determination. These adjustments didn't mean he abandoned his beliefs or his vision for modernizing the monarchy. Instead, developed more sophisticated methods for advancing those goals in ways that brought people along rather than alienating them. The relationship between Charles and William gradually improved over the following year. They would never have the easiest father-son dynamic, as their personalities and perspectives were genuinely different in fundamental ways. But they developed a mutual respect that acknowledged these differences while finding common ground in their shared commitment to the institution they both served. They learned to disagree without destroying their relationship, to debate without demeaning each other, and to make decisions together even when neither was entirely satisfied with the outcome. James Morrison continued his career in royal protection for many more years. The incident in the King's study became a defining moment in his professional life. Though not in the negative way he had initially feared, it demonstrated his commitment to his duty and his willingness to make difficult decisions under pressure. These qualities led to increased responsibilities and eventual promotion within the Royal Protection Service. He became known as someone who could be trusted to handle sensitive situations with discretion and good judgment. Someone who understood that rules existed for important reasons, but that there were rare moments when breaking those rules was the right thing to do. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed that day. Even decades later, when he retired from royal service and could have written memoirs that would have been commercially successful, he maintained his silence about the private moments he had observed. Some things, he believed, were meant to remain private, regardless of how much time had passed or how much public interest existed. The trust that had been placed in him by the royal family was not something to be betrayed for money or attention. This integrity was recognized and appreciated by those who knew him. It became part of his legacy within the royal protection community. The broader lesson of the incident extended beyond the specific individuals involved. It became a case study used in training programs for new royal protection officers. The details were carefully sanitized to protect the privacy of the royal family. But the core dilemma remained relevant for teaching purposes. How do you balance respect for privacy with responsibility for safety? When do you trust protocol, and when do you trust your instincts? What do you do when all your options are imperfect and you have to choose in the moment with incomplete information? These questions had no easy answers. But discussing James's situation helped new officers think through the complexity of their role. For the palace staff members who had been aware of the incident, it served as a reminder that the royal family were human beings dealing with human problems. Despite their extraordinary circumstances, the shouting that had been heard through doors and walls, the tension that had radiated through corridors, the argument between father and son that had escalated beyond anyone's control, these were things that happened in families everywhere, regardless of wealth or position. The difference was that when it happened to the royal family, the consequences and complications were magnified by the weight of history, tradition, and public expectation. Years later, when historians would write about King Charles's reign and Prince William's role in shaping the modern monarchy, they would not know about this particular incident. It would remain one of countless private moments that occurred behind palace walls, important to those directly involved but invisible to the broader historical record. The tension between tradition and change, between father and son, between different visions of what the monarchy should be, these themes would be documented and analyzed. But the specific confrontation that James Morrison had interrupted, the moment when those tensions had exploded into shouting and anger, would remain known only to a small circle of people who understood the value of discretion. The incident taught everyone involved something important about themselves and about each other. Charles learned that his authority as king didn't mean his judgment was infallible, and that listening to his son's perspectives made him a better leader rather than a weaker one. William learned that pushing for change required patience and diplomacy as much as conviction and courage. James learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant accepting consequences and trusting that integrity would ultimately be recognized and valued. These lessons, learned in a moment of crisis and confrontation, shaped how each man approached his responsibilities in the years that followed. In the end, the day when a royal guard stepped between a king and his heir became a story about the complexity of duty, the importance of judgment, and the reality that even those who live in palaces must navigate the messy, complicated dynamics of family relationships and institutional responsibility. It was a reminder that protocols and traditions existed for good reasons, but that rigid adherence to rules without consideration of context and circumstance could itself be a form of failure. The balance between these competing demands was something that everyone in that room had struggled with, and the fact that they had all emerged from the experience with greater wisdom and maturity was perhaps the most important outcome of a very difficult day.